Ooh, you guys, I found this really interesting article in Ancient Origins. Uh, it's about the tomb of Alexander the Great. And one of the great mysteries of antiquity is the final resting place of that mighty royal warrior Alexander the Great. His biographer, Arrian, fails to mention the funeral preparations, but Diodorus does in his Library of History. Diodorus mentions that Alexander's body was mummified in the Egyptian fashion. He had been, after all, the previous pharaoh of all Egypt, and placed in a solid gold anthropoid sarcophagus, similar to Pharaoh Tutankhamun's, which was then placed in another golden casket and overlaid with a purple robe. This assemblage was then placed upon a great wagon, which had suspension to mitigate rough terrain, measuring 8 by 12 cubits and covered with a roof of overlapping scales. The project engineer for this great undertaking was called Erhidaeus, and the result of his labors was said to have surpassed all others in cost and was famed for the excellence of its workmanship. This immense and ornate carriage apparently took Erhidaeus 2 years to construct, but eventually it departed. It was drawn by 64 mules and set off from Persia on the long journey to Alexander's final resting place. Such was the scale of the project that the cortege had its own team of road builders to smooth the way. The final destination was said to be Egypt, and more specifically the Temple of Amun at Siwa in the western desert. However, Ptolemy Soter, one of Alexander's generals, who would eventually found the Greco-Egyptian line of Ptolemaic pharaohs of Egypt, marched his army as far as Syria to meet the cortege. Ptolemy proposed to entomb Alexander's sarcophagus in Alexandria instead of Siwa. But is this really what happened all those years ago? It is claimed by others that Perdiccas, another of Alexander's generals, was actually escorting Alexander's cortege back to Agai in Macedonia, the burial place of Alexander's ancestors. Perdiccas had been named as regent for Alexander the Fourth, the infant son of Alexander the Great, and so it is often assumed that Ptolemy Soter forcibly appropriated the sarcophagus of Alexander the Great from General Perdiccas and took it to Alexandria for personal propaganda purposes. Interestingly, Elian also adds that the sarcophagus of Alexander was separated from the great wagon and transported meanly. Perdiccas recaptured the ornate wagon and thought he had regained the remains of Alexander, but they were still held by Ptolemy. But would this strategy have suited Ptolemy's plans to take over all of Egypt and much of Alexander's great empire? While denying the relics of Alexander to a rival claimant would be logical, surely the tomb of Alexander resting in Egypt would legitimize the claim to the throne of the infant Alexander IV, and not Ptolemy himself. Alexander IV was the legitimate heir to the empire, and the only mitigating circumstance to deny his heritage was the fact that he was not pure Greek, being the son of Roxanne, Alexander's Persian wife. So what would Ptolemy have really done with Alexander's sarcophagus to maximize his claim to the throne of Egypt? It is entirely possible that Ptolemy hid the sarcophagus in the Levant, Phoenicia, as a method of minimizing the influence of the Alexandrian royal line. The many later reports to a tomb of Alexander in Alexandria may well be the result of a later tourist trade, similar to the one that flourished at the supposed site of the Homeric Troy in northwestern Anatolia. The problem here is that the tomb of Alexander the Great is completely missing from history. With the care and expense said to have been lavished upon it, Alexander's final resting place would no doubt have been very famous, and yet we have no idea where this fabulous tomb was. Even the classical historians are confused, and so the location of this magnificent mausoleum must have been lost to history in a very early era. So where did the ornate sarcophagus of Alexander finally rest? What may have happened is that Ptolemy Soter did not want the fame of Alexander the Great to eclipse his own rule of Egypt. Thus, the sarcophagus could not be allowed to enter Egypt proper, but neither could Ptolemy destroy the mortal remains of such a famous and godlike character, and so they would have to be lain in some relatively secret location where the legend of Alexander could be safely put to bed. Ptolemy is said to have met the cordage and appropriated the sarcophagus in Syria, a region that includes all of the Levantine coast. Ptolemy may well have interred the remains of Alexander in the Levant, and if so, then it is entirely possible that we still have the outer sarcophagus that held Alexander's golden coffin.